Well, hello, this is Jason T. Ingram coming to you from my travel trailer in Central Oregon. I'm a multimedia artist and mental health activist, and most of my speaking out has been on these video projects. It's hard for me to be out in public here lately. I've been doing a lot of healing and a lot of restoration. And during that time, though, when I'm sort of like kind of hidden out of the public world here and haven't really done a lot of performing or anything, at least not in any kind of real organized and recognized setting, is that I do some social experiments, and I like to go to churches and I like to see how people respond to certain things. And I'm always interested to see if they're willing to include me as I am and not try to influence me in directions that are going against my will, because that is something that I've learned as far as like, if you ever get into these circles where people are doing magic and witchcraft and all this kind of stuff, though, there's some people that think that they can get other people to do stuff. And then there's some people that say, well, that's what black magic is. Whatever kind of symbols, whatever kind of spells or whatever you put on people, if you're trying to get someone to do something that they don't want to do, some people say that that's evil. However, if you get in the context of, the Bible and God, and this is right, and this is the way everybody in the whole world should be, or the whole universe, whether they're octopus aliens, like young Sheldon said to the pastor in the Young Sheldon show. And so that's an interesting thing, and I talk about that a couple of episodes ago about this rightness thing, is that I'm right. It gives me the illusion of power. It allows me to justify influencing somebody to do something that, whether it's in their best interest or not, it still is building this kingdom. And if you think about it, like, for instance, I've been watching the remake or the continuation or the prequel, rather, of Jim Henson's Dark Crystal. And what you get is you get these guys that live forever, and they're coming in from another world and saying, hey, we're your lords, we're your boss, and they drain their resources, literally drain the life out of the gelflings and stuff. So anything with those kinds of principles that are trying to own people, that are trying to infiltrate their will, whether it's in the people's best interest or not, and if somebody doesn't want to be a born-again Christian and they feel like they're scared to do it, or they're lured into it because it meets a lot of needs, then the whole Bible mentality can have a lot of cult-like characteristics without actually being a cult and with actually not having a centralized organization. For instance, the Orthodox Church isn't centralized as far as all the orthodoxy is concerned, because it usually has to do with different countries. However, organizations like the Roman Catholic Church is all centered in the Vatican, and of course the LDS Church centered in the holy city of Salt Lake City. And so what we're dealing with mostly when I talk about Christianity and insanity is my experience of having been introduced into a world for 12 years of my life that was Bible-based Christianity, that's very synonymous with the Trinity broadcasting type worldview. And if you go to websites of certain churches, then often they have a web page that says what we believe. And typically, it'll say that we believe that the Bible's the inspired Word of God, and they use a lot of King James English too, like Word of God, and baptism in full immersion and stuff like that. This is a very Protestant type thing. And then as you get down, we believe in the further work of salvation and sanctification with the evidence of speaking in other tongues and the gifts of the Spirit and healing and miracles and stuff. And then that's what we call the Pentecostal, charismatic, full gospel type circles, and there's another word I use for it, but I can't remember. They call it spirit-filled, is a lot of times they identify themselves. We're a spirit-filled church. So what I'm dealing with is mostly that world, because it seems to be the big thrust of Western culture when it comes to religion. It's still one of the fastest growing movements. And then we have Islam that is also becoming an amazing influence around the world too. It's just that in Western culture, and especially our influence on other countries, it is the Pentecostal charismatic type folks, not so much the Baptists and the dispensationalists, although I do talk about it. But there's a couple of stories I want to talk about before I want to get into that, though. I do want to clear up something, though, as far as the emphasis on violence over sex. We're not advocating for violence, and we're not advocating for no sex. It's just that if we have to choose what kind of entertainment or what kind of things we talk about, it seems to be more socially accepted in Bible culture to talk about violent acts and using those as pictures and types and shadows of our battle that we go through as, you know, humans in the human experience, or Christians trying to survive with their faith and being heavily persecuted and dealing with oppression in the invisible and the visible world. And so there's a passage that people seem to quote, and it sort of like, and I'm going to use the word dispensation again, is that it's basically saying the Old Testament was fulfilled, an eye for an eye, that kind of a thing. And then the Apostle Paul says that we wage war not against flesh and blood, but against the principalities and powers and the rulers of this air in the heavenly or the spiritual realms. And I'm paraphrasing different translations with that passage. So, and of course, you know, Jesus would say, I'm here to fulfill the law. And he was here to add sort of more of an internal interpretation of the law. So it's not just about actions. It's not just about obeying the Sabbath and tithing your mint and cumin and all this kind of stuff. It has to do with, if you have lust in your heart, then that's really bad. You should poke your eye out or cut off your hand if you do this, or stuff like that. And so that is a good thing, to the simple fact that we don't want to advocate violence. And a lot of times we point at Islam and they say they're the violent ones, it's okay for them to do violence. However, what happens, though, even if a church believes that physical violence isn't okay, however, it's okay to watch violent stuff, it's okay to talk about violent stuff, even if it has to do with, well, this just represents the spiritual battle that I go through, or the kind of persecution that I go through at work or with my family or whatever it is, that are unbelievers and they act like Philistines, kind of like that too. What happens is that it gets a mentality that aggressive action is okay. And what happens is there's sort of this, and I hate to say it though, but there's sort of this sleeper cell kind of a thing, that we like to point at Islam and say, you know, even any Muslim who doesn't have any ties to terrorism are potentially dangerous because they believe that it's okay, or they believe that these suicide bombers or whatever these suicide people are, that there's some kind of heroes and stuff like that. I don't believe that the common mentality of Islam advocates for that, although that's what Western culture, we are fed those views of Islam. However, we don't seem to be fed the views about Christianity that are very similar, that if there was some kind of holy war, if there was something that happened where somebody was invading our country with a different religion and we were to take up arms, these are the kinds of people that would be first in line to join the army, and I was one of them. I was raised a conscientious objector, and I joke that I was a conscientious objector because, for the simple fact that, one, I was tired of my family's influence and all of their influence having to do with pacifism when they were very aggressive. And there was a gender role reversal, which I thought was a weird standard to try to live by. And the fact that I was a mentally ill hippie with a lot of physical and mental problems that no military in their right mind would ever want me as an 18-year-old because of how incredibly fucked up I was. And I think maybe I was the only one that knew what was going on inside of me, because it was sort of imposed onto me that I was to be this high business and social functioning type person, and that's how I was going to be a successful artist. But that's another story. So, when it comes to violence, no, it's rare that a church would openly advocate for violent acts in the physical. It's just interesting when you get around people that are into this spiritual warfare. And this is another interesting thing too, because there's a lot of doctrines that go on, especially in the 90s when I was around churches. There was a lot of this emotional healing stuff, which is really good. The Vineyard had Plumb Line, the Foursquare had Cleansing Stream, and then that all kind of turned into more sort of like Celebrate Recovery type stuff. And I go into like bashing CR because I've never heard anybody bash Celebrate Recovery before. A lot of folks sing their praises and don't realize the psychological harm that some of those recovery programs do, the work of what a mental health professional should do. Same with this emotional healing stuff, although I actually had a lot of results with especially Cleansing Stream, although a lot of it was squirrely, and the guy who ran it, I think, ended up in some kind of weird sexual stuff that was harmful. I don't know the story about it, but it kind of came and went. But it was interesting how he had stories where he was convinced that Christians could be possessed by demons or entities or spirits or whatever it was. And that could also be a form of insanity as well, if somebody has got something that's going on in their head that's influencing them to just completely lose control and scream and yell. There was this story, I can't remember the details about, but the guy that started Cleansing Stream said that there was somebody who ended up, I guess, falling down on their front yard or something like that and screaming and yelling. And he said, I don't understand it, because this was somebody who identified as a born-again Christian. How could they have all this influence of all this evil stuff? Well, there's also something else too, is that there's this expression, this is an old one, this probably goes back 100 years or so, Lord, save this person by hook or by crook. I don't know where they came up with that thing, but you hear all this weird stuff like spiritual warfare. Another one is generational curses, and it's kind of interesting, because if you were to look at theology, even from a metaphysical perspective, you can see that there are negative impartations that go and are handed down with the cycle of trauma, and there could be even some entity activity as well, which would be a psychological and metaphysical explanation of why you see the same problem like sexual abuse being handed down in an unbreakable cycle of trauma that produces more trauma and more trauma down the generations. Well, we heal that trauma, we change our behaviors and our thinking, so we treat people with the respect that they need and not the kind of treatment that our parents gave us. And that is the big goal of, I think, everybody, in order for us to obtain some kind of thing that resembles world peace. And I admire how Bible-based Christianity is attempting to do that, and I think they've been successful at some of that stuff as well. So, I do talk a lot about sexual abuse and other trigger stuff like that, but I didn't really tell this story that I wanted to tell, and I'll just briefly touch on this too. About 6, 7, 8 years ago or so, I had this inkling to kind of go back to my recent roots that I had just kind of walked away from, for lack of a better term, the anti-gay churches, because I was involved in a lot of very liberal, very watered down, social justice, tolerant and affirming type places, and I just didn't find it a very spiritual environment. And so I went to this one that was one of those kind of river revival churches, like I was talking about Rodney Howard-Browne and some of that stuff like that, because I was looking for a congregation where I was living at the time that I felt like I could do this. This is another trend too that was big about 10, 15 years ago. They call it soaking. And what happens, they create this atmosphere with this certain type of music, and they lie on the floor, they lie on their pews, and they just go into this meditative state, and it's very healing, and it's a great experience for a lot of people. So that's what I was looking for, and you just didn't find that among most of these liberal churches. And you might find gay affirming churches that have a evangelical or Pentecostal thrust to them, and I've only found one of those that I really like. It was in Vancouver, Canada. Most of them I thought were really squirrely and very performance oriented as well. Like a lot of Pentecostals are accused of being a performance. Well, there was this one guy, speaking of performance, he was a really good preacher, And he was just this big old cuddly teddy bear of a man. I was just like, I just thought he was so cute. And he played the piano. I mean, he was just, he was kind of like my dream pastor. And he was this one who sort of identified with ones that they call flowing in the Holy Spirit and stuff like this, and a lot of spontaneous music, a lot of spontaneous preaching and stuff like that. And then a lot of other Pentecostal charismatic stuff like the laying on of hands and things like that. And so anyways, I was talking to my favorite gay minister, and I was telling her, because she was pretty, it was interesting though, she knew what was going on in gay churches and the non-gay affirming churches, which I thought was very admirable. Very few people build the bridges when it comes to the gay issue. And look up Canyon Walker Ministries, I think, is another one too, where she's this fundy that's like a total fag hag, and she likes to hang out with gays, and then she goes into these circles that don't affirm gays, and so that's interesting. But anyways, I'm I'm digressing as usual, and I have to wet my whistle. So what happened with this church when I was talking about, I started attending this revival church, and she said that I should Google him and see if he is listed on, get this, one of these sexual offender type websites like Family Watchdog or one of those. Now, mind you, familywatchdog.com, I think that's one of them. I don't know if they're still around, but they will not list all the sexual predators that have been dangerous to minors. They will list repeat offenders. So, for instance, there'll be a guy and he'll be in prison for 6 years. He has to get his picture taken every year and register and tell the government what he's doing and what air he's breathing and what he's thinking about it, and stuff like that. They don't get listed publicly unless they're a repeat offender. So this pastor had a background. Now, it was quite a while back. It was like maybe 20-something years before that particular time when I was going to his church. And it listed his crimes against children, and it was really shocking. And so I thought, well, it's a good thing it's a small church. People don't bring their children, except there was a mom there that brought her baby who was about a year old or something like that. So he didn't seem to have access to children. Well, it turns out I actually followed him to another church where he was a guest preacher, and there he had access to children. I don't know if he had private access to children. I don't know if everybody knew or just thought, maybe I'll Google this pastor and see if he turns up on any of the sexual offender websites. When people see somebody who is displaying a lot of spiritual power, like this, laying on of hands and the gifts of the Spirit and healing and tongues and all that kind of stuff, it's really hard to picture that person doing a horrible crime like that. And like I said, that is the worst crime that anybody could do to anybody, except maybe, some form of physical torture and imprisonment or something like that. Sexual abuse is sometimes even worse because they're lured into it, usually from somebody in a place of power. And like I said before, it's not so much an issue with stranger danger. That is a whole different type of perpetrator that is just as dangerous. It's just that people are afraid to confront those in places of power and authority. And of course, the perceived power thing is very deceiving, because there's a lot of people that distrust those on the outside and that have an over amount of trust of those on the inside. And I've noticed that too, especially when I go into a church and I'm an outsider and I look around and I think, boy, it's obvious that I have more knowledge and more experience about, let's say, sound systems and arranging a worship team or something like that. There's a lot I could offer to these churches. Because I'm not trusted or recognized or known by them, they won't even let me volunteer what I could bring to them to make their worship team not sound like a bunch of mud or something, like something very simple, very practical. It doesn't matter if I'm this Holy Ghost believer or not, or if I'm this, what they would consider a total sinner. If I have information that would help their organization, I would offer it for free. I can't serve and volunteer with these organizations because I'm on the outside, and at the same time they have insiders, and I've known some of these guys who are horrible perpetrators who should not have access to children. And here's my idea. Because what happens with these preachers, and I've done this before, I was one of those sort of like Jesse Duplantis and Kenneth Copeland. A lot of these guys started out doing music, even Oral Roberts and T.L. Osborne, who I forgot T.L. Osborne's name a couple episodes ago as well. And I got to meet T.L. Osborne. He's just out of this world. And so anyways, he'd be playing his accordion, and Oral Roberts would be doing some music too, and that's how they got their start. So I got my start doing music, and they trusted me without any kind of background check or anything, even though I've never had a background harming children at all. It's just that they just did not even check to see whether that was the case or not, because they trusted me and they saw that I would flow in this spiritual stuff, and they just thought that that meant that somebody was living a life that was harmless to minors. And so I have seen these men put in positions of power because they demonstrate a lot of what people think is spiritual power. A lot of it is hypnotic suggestion. And hypnotic suggestion is one of the very things that give these sexual predators the ability to lure minors into doing horrible things. And so anyways, that's my soapbox about that. And that story is really sad, because when I saw him at this other church and I saw all the kids that were around him, it took me a long time to think about what you could do with somebody in that situation, because a lot of times, like with the Catholic Church, they send them away. And that's what happened when I was traveling and I was working with a church, and I knew a guy who was a sexual predator, and I nearly caught him in the act. And I don't talk about it very much because it was very traumatic, and it's scary, and it's disgusting, and it was very triggering to me because of, you know, my background and everything like that. But the only thing I heard what they did was they just moved him to like another province or state or whatever. And, you know, of course, that does not cure the problem. If somebody is needing that much supervision to not be around children, and they have to have people around him to make sure that this guy does not get around children, especially alone, they need to put him in an environment where he's like a chaplain, like a military chaplain, or even a football team chaplain or something like that. And if he's living near a prison and he has a lot of accountability, constant, like 24/7, and he's still preaching because they feel like they have to, because there's a scripture where Paul says, "Woe unto me if I preach not the gospel." So it's like an obsession for them, and I've done that obsession. There's a power that comes upon me, or an illusion of power, when I was preaching the gospel, and I was doing street preaching, and I was doing it in English, and I was even trying to speak another language at one point, a couple languages, and there was definitely identifying with something really powerful, even though I look back on it now, and it's like, I feel like I was really trying to influence people in ways that they might not necessarily want to go to, and taking advantage of people that were going through a form of a mental health crisis, and sort of profiting from that. And I mean by profiting is that the more influence I have on people, and I had, you know, on average once a year or so, that I would meet somebody on a bus or a roommate or something like that, and I would influence them to become a born-again Christian. They would pray with me and stuff like that, and I would feel like I had this big brownie point sort of thing. There was one church in Anchorage where they called it moose bucks. If you invite somebody to come to church, they give you moose bucks, and you could buy Bibles and stuff like that with these moose bucks. So there was a lot of incentive to bring people into church. And the last church I visited, it was a little creepy though, but I'm kind of glad they did it. But all I wanted to do was go in and see the inside of this church, because I was curious if they had a piano and stuff like that. There was a lot of people there, and anyways, I just sat there for 5 minutes, didn't even really get a chair in the congregation. It was really full, and I just didn't feel like sitting through announcements and sermons and stuff. But one guy was very attentive right when I came in, even though I came in late. And then as I walked out, he was, still very attentive to me. And there was another lady that actually followed me out of the building and wanted to talk to me. And I just told her that I just wanted to see the inside of the building. And she was like, oh, okay. And I smiled and she smiled and I walked away. But the thing is that there's a lot of people that come into churches that don't feel comfortable getting mental health care, that are in a crisis, or they don't have access to mental health care. But a lot of times is that they don't even really know it's available, or there's so much stigma with going to a mental health organization when they're in a time of crisis, because we don't make it easy for people to get crisis support. And especially if you call a crisis line, they won't do anything unless you threaten harm to yourself or somebody else. And that's the way things are these days. It's very rare you will get any kind of support if you call the county crisis line or wherever it is in whatever country you're in. So I like it that churches are sensitive to people that come in that are new, and they find out what their needs are and stuff like that, which I haven't had really any follow-up. I've given my information to a handful of churches over the last year or so, and they don't follow up and find out what my needs are. And even if I am in a major crisis, they haven't been concerned about what I really need. It's always about what they think I need, and it's typically counterproductive or useless, which is really sad. So in a way, it's kind of cultish to follow somebody out of a church. It's kind of creepy, but at the same time, though, if they really do find out what somebody's needs are and find out if they can meet those needs, especially if it's referring them to clinical mental health care, which would be amazing, which I don't think they do. One of the things that I challenged some of these ex-gay leaders on several years back was I wrote this big letter and had it signed by some other ex-gay survivors that have been to straight camp and conversion therapy, reparative therapy, whatever you call it. And it's basically saying, hey, if you think this is the lesser of two evils to send somebody over to a church or an organization that can get them healing and affirm where they're at, if you don't do that, then typically they end up in self-harm. And of course, there's no response with that too. But that would be wonderful if folks that have an anti-gay position would say, hey, I think it's wrong for you to be gay, but if that's what's going to keep you from self-harm, and if that's what's going to keep you in the faith is maybe watering down your faith a little bit and doing something that we think is deplorable, then we want to give you our blessing and we want to refer you to this, because otherwise these folks end up going off the deep end, and they end up in drugs and a lot of self-harm and a lot of suicide. So that would be one of the things that I would like to see the Trinity Broadcasting world do, and it'll take a long time for that. There is a little bit of that sort of gay affirming mentality, but it comes more of the fact that, oh, we just want to apologize to them and say, oh, well, that church hurt you, we're sorry about that. But they don't change their position about sexual minorities and stuff like that. And I mentioned this before about how sad it is when I talk to church leaders about conversion therapy. It's like they say, well, we're sorry that that church hurt you. But what happens is their mentality and their belief advocating conversion therapy, like Vice President Pence seems to advocate for conversion therapy. And just saying that publicly is a negative influence that undermines the well-being of sexual minorities, and that very well influences them to do self-harm, maybe indirectly, but just saying that, hey, people should change their sexuality is a harmful influence. And that's another thing that I wish would stop.